Around April 20th, 1945, the U.S. Army fought the Battle of Nuremberg with the German Army. It was a fierce battle. Support from the Royal Air Force, support from American bombers. The city was left devastated. A few days later, elements of the Third Army under General Patton entered to take control of all positions. Different groups of soldiers combed the ruins in search of small redoubts where German soldiers might be. On the morning of April 30th, 1945, a group of soldiers arrived at a place on Panier Platz in the center of Nuremberg. The ruins of an old 17th-century house had been spread out in such a way that they made it possible to see that there was an entrance to something, probably the entrance to a tunnel or a bunker. Those soldiers had the mission of locating Nazi soldiers who were hiding around there and reducing them, pulling them out, finishing off the pockets of resistance. The resistance had been quite fierce. The soldiers go in and make their way through a passage until they reach a vault. It is hard to enter. There is a lot of rubble. The doors are jammed, but they manage to get in. Inside, they observe some wooden boxes, one of them carefully placed on a sort of altar, but they do not see any German soldier. One of the Americans approaches, lifts the lid, and sees that inside there is some object. At that instant, someone calls them and they have to leave. The place is secured. It has literally been conquered. On their way out, they close the heavy doors and continue the advance toward Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich. A few hours later, in the afternoon, in the Chancellery bunker, a group of German soldiers begin to burn the remains of two people. On an improvised bonfire, in a hole in the ground and with liquid fuel, with petroleum or gasoline, they incinerate two corpses. They are two people, Adolf Hitler and his wife, Eva Braun. Hitler has committed suicide, more or less about 2 hours after the American soldiers had entered that strange bunker at Panier Platz. What had happened there? Adolf Hitler had been defeated. His enterprise to conquer the world, the Third Reich that would rule the world for 1,000 years, was definitely a failure. Its decline had begun in 1942, when the Russians began to defeat him on the Eastern Front. But that particular day, April 30th, is remembered not only for the suicide, but for that strange incident. A few months later, on August 7th, 1945, the search for a series of historical objects had reached that same place, Panier Platz. At the head of a group of soldiers and accompanied by two officials of the defeated Nazi regime, Lieutenant Warren Horn was looking for this site. Walter Horn was the correct name. This lieutenant in the U.S. Army belonging to Company C of the Third Army was a historian, a specialist in medieval objects, and as such he belonged to a very particular group in charge of recovering historical objects that had been stolen by the Nazi Army. The various reports had led him to Panier Platz, specifically to that ruined old building where the American soldiers had been. The different reports coincided, so when he arrived, removed the doors, and entered, he came upon exactly what he was looking for. In the wooden box that sits on that old altar there is none other than a unique piece, the Spear of Destiny, the Spear of Longinus. It is still there. There are other things there of great value. They are part of the treasure that the Nazis had recovered from a good part of Europe. But specifically this piece is key, the Spear of Destiny. The pieces are recovered, and the spear is shown to General Patton. Patton was in command of the Third Army. He was a very high-ranking general, much appreciated, much loved by his soldiers, and he had also done some very strange things. He was a very crazy guy, but he had won the war being there. When they show that to him, he takes it in his hands. He is the winner. He, his army which he commanded, had conquered Nuremberg, where the piece was. For a few days the piece remains with the Allies, that is, with the U.S. Army. It is being guarded there in the offices, while arrangements are made for a return to its owners. On December 20th, 1945, the piece is officially handed over to representatives of the Austrian government, specifically people belonging to the museum in Vienna, the Habsburg Museum, where the piece belonged. During the conversation and some jokes, the Spear of Longinus is not an easy topic to deal with, and even though this was a general of the U.S. Army, he feels a certain tingle at returning it. The next day, General Patton dies with a broken neck in a traffic accident, under a more than strange condition that has given rise to much speculation. While being driven in his car by his chauffeur, they crash into the rear of a truck, and the general dies with a broken neck. By January 4, 1946, the piece, the Spear of Destiny, is once again on display in a private area within the museum. Do you know what the Spear of Destiny is? Do you know what relationship it has with all this? What I have told you may seem erratic, but we have to go a little further back in time. In 1938, Adolf Hitler, yes, the same Adolf Hitler who was being burned out in the yard there on the ground in a hole with gasoline in 1945, April 30, in 1938 had taken power, total control of Germany. He had annexed Austria and had entered the museum where the Spear of Destiny was exhibited. His path was direct. During his visit to Austria, he had been in two places very insistently. The first was the tomb of the composer Wagner, from which he came out ecstatic, and the second, the site where the Spear of Destiny was on display. His objective was to take it, and so he did. Arriving there, having taken total control, even being the powerful man of Germany and on the verge of initiating the conquest of Europe, what he wanted was to seize that spear. Later, he would transfer it to different sites within Germany, first in Nuremberg, in a very special exhibition, in an old chapel where certain very special meetings were held, later there in Panier Platz, in a bunker. When the situation becomes complicated and the bombings are tremendous, that is where he places it. But what is all this that I am telling you? Well, let us go even further back in time. We go to Judea, to Israel, Palestinian territory. We are at Golgotha, the place of the skull, the place where people are crucified, and we are in the year 0 of our era. A Jew has been brutally punished. They have given him about 80 lashes on his back. They have damaged his back in a way few people would have seen, because, in addition, the lashes are with a kind of whip that has at the tip pieces of animal bone, like vertebrae and things of that sort, pieces of metal whose function is to lodge and tear. At the moment they strike someone's back, that digs in, they pull, and the flesh rips. Hebrew law dictated that the maximum number of lashes was 39, but this man has been given about 80. Even so, he is still alive. His condition is quite critical, but he is alive. A while later, they place on him the crossbeam, the horizontal part of the cross. The objective was to carry it on his back all the way to where the pedestal was. Then, by means of a pulley and a rope, they hoisted the condemned so that he would be left hanging. But the viciousness toward this man is tremendous. Whereas the usual practice was to tie the convicts to the cross, this one they have nailed. There have been different ways to interpret it. At first it was thought he had been nailed through the hands, but no. The crucifixion was at the level of the wrist where it would not tear through the palm of the hand. Otherwise, after a strong effort or after a long time, it would break and he would fall. But he has been nailed both in the feet and in the hands so that he cannot push himself up. Why is this? Well, so that he dies of asphyxiation. Death on the cross is a slow, exasperating death. The Romans, who are the ones hanging this man, are not very fond of death on the cross, and they are barbarians, very cruel people, but they reserve this only for seditionists, for those who have risen up, for troublemakers, for slaves who have rebelled. They use this death. Once on the cross, the person is left hanging, and little by little the thorax weakens until he can no longer move and cannot breathe. Death is by asphyxia, as I was saying. In this case, the man there is none other than Jesus of Nazareth, who has been judged, condemned to lashes, and subsequently condemned to death on the cross. According to the biblical accounts of the Gospels, Jesus Christ is hung and nailed to the cross. At his side there is a thief, a bandit, and on the other side there is another bandit. They are tied, they do not have their feet nailed, but the matter does not end there. At a certain hour the Romans did not like to be out there exposed, Since at Golgotha there were many people, and there could be problems, because according to their beliefs what they had done was to hang a troublemaker, and therefore there could be problems. So one of the centurions gives the order to break the legs. This technique was very simple. From below they set up a ladder, and with a maul, a piece of wood, a kind of club, they broke the tibias of the condemned so that he would immediately slump and die of asphyxiation more quickly. In the case of Jesus Christ, who was already hanging there when the order is given to break the legs, the guard who was there, who was simply a Roman soldier, not a legionary, not any special figure, simply a Roman soldier, observes and thinks that he is already dead. So he informs his superior that he is already dead. Even so, the superior says to him, "Stick him." The Romans used a spear which they called a pilum. The Roman pilum was a spear. It was throwable. It was a thing about 2 meters long, and it was part of the armament. The other armament was the gladius, which was the sword. In this case, that soldier, from below, so as not to climb up, pierces the right side. According to the biblical account, when he does this and withdraws the spear, a significant amount of water comes out, and then blood. Up to there is the biblical account. Both John and Matthew relate something very similar, but in neither case do they mention the name of that soldier, nor do they mention more details. However, over time, in several later accounts, things would be told such as, for example, the miracle of the eyes. As it was said, that soldier had problems seeing. He did not see, and for this reason he was condemned to be simply a guard, not a warrior. But at the moment of withdrawing that, and when the water falls on his eyes, he is healed. The spear would therefore become an object of worship, a sacred relic. The name of that soldier in the biblical texts, the official Gospels, let us call them, is not mentioned. It is mentioned in later texts where he is known as Cassius Longinus, or in some cases as Gaius Cassius Longinus, to be more specific. The first time the name of Longinus is found is later in a drawing, in fact, in a drawing 400 years after the death of Christ. But it is said that that object, that spear with which they had pierced Christ's side, becomes a powerful relic. And then the story arises that whoever possesses the relic, according to this, will have the power to control the world, for good or for evil. The legend woven from those early years of Christianity, in the 400s or 500s, is that whoever has in his power the spear will control the world, but whoever loses it will lose his life. And so the legend of the Spear of Longinus grows, the spear of destiny, because whoever has it will control the destiny of the world. Many stories are told about how it was recovered. There are very varied versions, all within the realm of legend. There are no specific data. There is no clear history. Some say it was found in a temple in the Holy Land, others that it was recovered from a basilica, others that it was found under a structure where the tomb of Jesus Christ was where the spear had been placed. The crown of thorns and the chalice of the Last Supper, the 3 sacred objects along with the nails of the cross. These objects have been considered objects of power for a long time by many beliefs, both esoteric and religious, which considered these relics to be of great power and great value. Here the matter is that it would not be until the 6th or 7th century of our era that the version of the Spear of Destiny begins to appear. But several Spears of Destiny appear. One of them appears in Armenia, another appears in France, another in the Vatican. And there's a very particular one that has a direct relationship with the Roman Empire. The spear that I am now showing you corresponds to this latter. According to tradition, this spear was given to one of the last emperors of the Roman Empire, to Constantine, in the 4th century, when the Pope gave him this so that he would have the power to win battles. For centuries it would continue to be passed on. Charles Martel in the 8th century would receive it, and would in turn bequeath it to Charlemagne, who in that same 8th century would become the great conqueror. He carried the spear in 47 battles. However, accidentally, while crossing a river, he drops it, someone takes it, and then Charlemagne stops winning battles and even loses his life. The spear would return to the power of the royal houses, and sometime later, in the 12th century, Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick the would again report having the Spear of Destiny to go to the Third Crusade. The intermediate points where the spear was have been very varied. It is said that it was in a convent, in the royal house, in the Vatican, but that in the end it returned so that Frederick, first Barbarossa as he was known, would go to the Third Crusade. And so it was. He had it. He had won battles. Tragically, and in the same way as what happened to Charlemagne when crossing a river, the spear falls. He would not let go of the spear. He falls. It is lost momentarily. He falls into the river seeking the spear, drowns, and dies. The next, well, it is said that the Templars recovered the spear and brought it back to Europe. But at some point, the story says that they also lost it, and the spear returned to the power of the royal houses, and the Templars disappeared. From there, it followed its course until it reached Nuremberg. In the 18th century, Nuremberg faces a siege by Napoleon Bonaparte, who, coincidentally, desired the Spear of Destiny. Napoleon Bonaparte knew the history of this, so he attacks Nuremberg to conquer the Spear of Destiny. The spear is sent to Austria, to the House of the Habsburgs. When the emergency ends, the spear remains in Austria, in Vienna, in the palace. Years later, Adolf Hitler, visiting the palace, discovers that piece and learns the entire long story and the fact that this was a symbol not only of Germanic power, as we have been led to think. Adolf Hitler believed in the power of this object. In fact, in one of the pages of Adolf Hitler's work Mein Kampf, he narrates the encounter with those objects. But perhaps he was not the most interested in the subject, but rather his second-in-command, Himmler, and even Goebbels, his faithful collaborators who were practicing esotericists and who knew the story of the Spear of Destiny. Years later, when he achieved power, the first thing he did was to take the Spear of Destiny, carry it with him, place it in Nuremberg at this site, which was an old chapel inside a cathedral where the chiefs met, because it was a symbol of power. What has to happen, happens. The war comes. Adolf Hitler keeps winning. You might ask, well, if the Spear of Destiny was so powerful, how did he lose? Very well, what I have told you so far is a combination of historical data and legend. What is historical is that the Americans recovered the Spear of Longinus that April of 1945 when they conquered Nuremberg. What is a fact is that on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life and was cremated. There are theories that point to his not having died there. The fact is that today it is known by DNA tests and by a positive identification of teeth that it was Adolf Hitler. What follows is the death of Patton. That is a historical fact. There is no way around it. And he dies the day after having handed over the box that contained the spear to the people of Vienna. But there is a very big problem. The spear I am showing you is not the spear of a Roman soldier. No, the spear exhibited in Vienna does not correspond in shape to a Roman soldier's spear. In Israel, the spear of a Roman soldier is called a pilum. This battle spear was a throwable tool. It was something thrown at a distance and used to be slender. What you see in the photograph, which we have shown a couple of times, does not seem to correspond. Certainly, the hilt could be, but the rest seems to be made from two knives, two long daggers. It is very heavy. This would not be used by a Roman soldier who used the spear to throw it, to keep the adversary at a distance. It was not a combat tool like a halberd or some other medieval thing. This was different. That doubt fit, and, in fact, the way it was put together did not correspond either. It was an assembly. For years there has been a debate about this because, in addition, the others do not seem to correspond either. The one in Armenia simply makes no sense. That is not a spear. That is the tip of some standard. The one in the Vatican is a fragment of another that was, I believe, in France. And according to what they say, they fit together well, but the test has never been done. Therefore, if this is not the spear, then what is it? And here come several theories. First, the Spear of Destiny, according to dating done in 2008, when it was subjected to various experiments in Vienna. The University of Vienna considered that the spear was manufactured in the 7th century. Yes, the 600s AD. That is, that steel, that casting, was not made in a Roman period, but much later, except for one piece. Here comes the interesting part. The spear is composed of various parts. The first are these two blades like daggers that are joined with a very tight silver wire. Then comes the hilt, and there is a kind of central channel that is formed between the two blades. There is the key. In the center of that there is a very ancient nail. The ancient nail corresponds to metal from the 1st century of our era. That was there at some point. Now the tests could not determine whether there was evidence of blood or any bodily fluid. Correct. After 2,000 years, it is unlikely there would be. And furthermore, having passed through the hands of all sorts of hierarchs of the royal houses of Europe, well, that was evidently cleaned, polished, and brightened many times. Whatever residue it may have had has disappeared, but it also has a silver wrapping that covers the nail, and then a very later gold one with an inscription, "The Cross of the Lord." If we wanted to think that the legend has some sense, this, the Spear of Destiny in Vienna, is the one that does. For many, this is not the spear that pierced Christ's side. For many, there was not even such a thing. But then we enter two discussions. There is a very interesting one. The first, there are data in the biblical account that point to the reality of the events. For example, the fact that the night before, Jesus Christ had sweated blood. This is a phenomenon that occurs when someone is under extreme stress, and the sweat glands, which are connected with different blood vessels, subjected to excessive blood pressure from stress and anguish, begin to sweat blood. That is described in the biblical account. After this, when we enter matters of when they pierce the right side, they do not pierce the heart. The heart is on the left side unless it is a reversed case. When they pierce the right side, water and blood come out. When someone develops a pleurisy due to asphyxia, the intercostal space fills with water. What they described was real. It was something that occurs. When a person is hanging on a cross and has been asphyxiated for hours, if you stick him, water and blood will come out. Therefore, the account made sense. The fact that a Roman guard was standing there and that he had vision problems also made sense. That guard was not fit for combat. He was not a Roman centurion, a combat man. This was a guard, a simple guard with a spear. Now, is this the spear? No, definitely not. Complete, it is not. But it was not said to be the complete spear either. In the account, there is talk of findings of fragments. Something that was hidden for centuries would not be complete. There are those who claim, within more esoteric circles, that the spear is made of fragments like that long metal piece in the center, which corresponds to the 1st century, and which coincidentally that long fragment inside could coincide with the tip of a Roman soldier's pilum. Now then, if this is formed by a part of the original Spear of Longinus, the account coincides quite well. Even the later account, considered apocryphal, and different texts that appeared more or less in the 3rd century of our era, narrate that after Christ's death, when he was placed in the tomb, his mother recovered certain elements, and later, after a long time, Saint Helena took charge of recovering them. And so it goes. Well, let's leave that aside. If this were, even in part, the Spear of Destiny, why did Adolf Hitler lose the war? And why did the Third Reich end up in tatters? Well, that is a good question. Perhaps because in reality he never had it. Perhaps because the spear itself remained in Nuremberg, or remained in Vienna, or somewhere else. For years there has been talk of a duplicate, a copy, a replica, and that the one Adolf Hitler had was in reality a copy, and that he foolishly thought all the time that he had a power object that would give him those extraordinary faculties to control the destiny of the world, whereas what he had was a replica. Another theory points out that in reality he would have had to keep it with him all the time, but when he left it, The spear was no longer with him, and for that reason, he lost. It is hard to know. It is a legend, an interesting legend. And here in Mexico, there is also a very interesting saying that says, "When the owl sings, the Indian dies." It is not true, but it happens. And throughout this reading, for this program, we have found these curious data. There is a lot of strange information. There is a lot of distorted information out there, and the great majority of information that exists is to repeat the same thing. But there are these curious facts, like this one, that Nuremberg falls on the 20th, but the investigations that lead to Panier Platz are until the 30th, and coincidentally that day Hitler commits suicide. Then the spear is recovered, all that, and when Patton hands it over, he dies the next day. So well, something strange. Does the Spear of Destiny have power to control the world?